What's going on, everyone? This is Kevin here from Smartphone Review Pro, and in this video, we're going to be going over pros and cons for the Motorola Moto G9 Power. So let's get started. Now first, we're going to go over my top 5 pros. Then, after that, we're going to go over my top 5 cons. However, I've got to say, in general, I like this phone quite a bit. So the cons that I'm going to be going over in this video are mostly nitpicking, but then again, they are things that I would like to see Motorola include in future smartphones. And in addition to that, if any of the cons that I point out are things that are especially important to you, then it probably is good to know about them before actually getting the phone. Now also, don't forget to check out my full hands-on and first impressions video with the Moto G9 Power. I do already have that here on the channel, and you'll probably learn even more about the phone. But let's get started. So coming in at number 1 is the display. Now with the Moto G9 Power, we're getting a very large display here at 6.8 inches. In addition to that, the display itself is 20.5 by 9. So we're getting a narrower but taller form factor here, even taller than many of the smartphones that came out in 2020. I know that 20 by 9 was especially popular with Samsung as well as Motorola, but it looks like with the Moto G9 Power, we're taking things even taller here at 20.5 by 9. Now one of the nice things about this form factor is that the display is massive, but the phone is still really easy to hold in one hand. Now coming in at number 2, and this probably is not much of a surprise, but that is the battery capacity. So with this device, we're getting a 6,000 milliamp hour internal battery, an absolutely massive battery on a smartphone. In fact, I can't think of too many other devices that I've covered ever before with a battery this large. So if you are somebody that's constantly using your phone, or maybe you're someone who just doesn't like to charge your phone too often, then the Moto G9 Power is probably a good option for you because again, it features one of the largest battery capacities that I've seen in a long time. Now there are some phones out there with bigger batteries, but really though, 6,000 milliamp hours is way bigger than many of the other devices that I cover here on the channel. In addition to that, this phone also supports 20 watt fast charging, so you will be able to recharge that really massive battery pretty quickly. Another benefit too of having a battery this big is that the battery degradation, which is inevitable because it happens with every phone, that's the way batteries work, but the battery degradation will not be nearly as obvious nearly as quickly. For example, one of the reasons why iPhones seem to have battery life that gets worse and worse very quickly after you get the phone is because the batteries in those phones are really tiny to begin with. Now, iPhones in general tend to be pretty battery efficient, but when you're already starting with a battery that's under 3,000 milliamp hours, even having the battery degrade by 10 or 15% is gonna be really obvious. Whereas with the Moto G9 Power, you're already getting incredible battery life from the beginning, so even if the battery does degrade a little bit, it's not gonna make too big of a difference. Like for example, maybe it will take you from 2 days of battery life to 1 day of battery life. Of course, that's less battery life, but you're still going to be able to get a full day of usage out of the phone. So the point is that getting a very big battery from the beginning is going to give this phone a lot more longevity compared to its various counterparts that have smaller batteries. Coming in at number 3 is the storage. So with the Moto G9 Power, we're getting 128 gigabytes of internal storage as well as microSD card expansion. That's quite a bit of internal storage. In fact, the iPhone 12, the base model, still has 64 gigabytes, and that's way more expensive than this phone. So this phone is a lot cheaper, but you're getting significantly more internal storage. And if you happen to need more storage in addition to the 128 gigabytes, you can always put a microSD card in the phone. So that's really awesome. Now coming in at number 4, and that is the fingerprint sensor and face unlock. So we do have a fingerprint sensor on the back of the phone. It is nice and fast, so it does work really well. Let's do that one more time. There we go. Very good. And in addition to that, the phone has face unlock. So it seemed like for a while, face unlock was kind of disappearing from a lot of budget devices, but it looks like it's making a comeback. And again, to verify here with you, you can see that we do have, of course, the fingerprint sensor, but again, face unlock, which you can easily set up. And then for the final major perk with this phone that is that we have NFC. So if you're someone that likes to use Google Pay, for example, or if you use other applications to make mobile payments, but they rely on NFC, this phone does have NFC. Now, one thing I do want to mention, it is this particular variant of the device that has NFC. So if you do happen to decide to buy this phone, you definitely should double check and make sure that it does have NFC, because I know that sometimes some variants of different phones, especially international devices like the Moto G9 Power, will have NFC and then others won't. So again, just make sure to double check so that you don't accidentally buy a variant of this phone that doesn't have NFC. But I'm not really aware of there being any variants of the phone that don't have it. But again, just make sure to double check. But now that we've gone over my top 5 pros and favorite things about the Moto G9 Power, let's now go over the top 5 cons. Now, if you've already looked at the specifications of this phone, some of these cons might not be too big of a surprise. But coming in at number 1, and that is that the display here is 720p. Now, it's not really a deal breaker because I think the display still does look nice. It is decently crisp and clear as well. And from a quick glance at the display, I actually would have assumed it was 1080p just because it does look really nice, but it is 720p. So it is pretty surprising too that with the display this big, they are giving us 720p, but again, that's what we're getting here. So I know that for my first pro I mentioned, that was that the phone has a big display, but the first con really is that the display is only 720p. So I suppose you're getting a bigger display, but at a compromise of the resolution being a bit lower. But again, looking at different apps and other things on the device, it's not like your first impression here would be that the display has a low resolution. So in general, I don't think it's a deal breaker that it's only 720p, but if it was 1080p, that would have been fantastic. The second con about the Moto G9 Power is that there's no ultra-wide camera. So we have a 64 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. But sadly, there is no ultra-wide camera. And it almost seems like a step back, especially since the Moto G Power does have an ultra-wide camera. And I really do wish it had it. It's a feature that I actually use quite a bit. At least for me. I don't know about everyone else, but I do use my ultra-wide angle camera quite a bit, and I really wish this phone did have one. Moving on to the fourth con about this phone, and that is the Google Assistant button. Now, I don't have anything against Google Assistant. In fact, I have quite a few Google Home Minis around my house, and I use them quite often. So I do appreciate having a virtual assistant, and the button does work well. I just wish that this button was remappable. The fact that you're stuck with using it with Google Assistant just seems like a missed opportunity to give us a multifunction button here so that the people that want to use it with the assistant can do it, but then the people that wouldn't use the assistant quite as much and want to have this button maybe take them quickly to a certain app could do that, but unfortunately there's no way to customize this button or remap it to do anything else. So that is a bit disappointing, especially when honestly, there's so many ways to access Google Assistant on the phone. You can tap on that button, you can tap on that button. So it's not like it's difficult to access it in the first place. Now my fourth con about this phone, and it is understandable considering that this is a budget device. So again, not really a big deal, but the build materials are not extremely impressive. We have a hard plastic material on the back of the phone. And again, it's not like it's really bad or anything, but it certainly doesn't really give me the impression of this being, even slightly premium. It does give a bit of a cheap look and feel to the phone. Now, I do understand that most people out there probably will be using this phone with a case. And if you are one of those people, then it literally doesn't matter at all. However, if they would have given us a little bit better of build materials, I would have liked to see that. And I'm also guessing that over time, this hard plastic material probably will be a bit more susceptible to picking up scratches. So if you do end up getting this phone, then I do definitely recommend getting a case for it. And the final con with the Motorola Moto G9 Power is the processor. Now, first thing I want to mention is the RAM. I think 4 gigs of RAM is perfectly fine. That's a good amount of RAM to get here with the phone. But the processor, which is the Qualcomm Snapdragon 662, doesn't really bring too much new to the table. Now, the Moto G8 Power and the Moto G Power, which was the North American variant of the phone, both of those phones featured the Qualcomm Snapdragon 665. Now, the 665 and the 662 are pretty similar. The 665 was released in kind of mid-2019, whereas the 662, which we're getting here with this phone, was released in early 2020. So the 662 is pretty much almost a successor to the 665, but you're not going to be getting too much of a performance gain from it. So it's almost very close to being equal. So I don't think having the Snapdragon 662 is necessarily a bad thing, but it would have been nice to see at least a decent performance jump going from the Moto G9 Power's 665. So I would have preferred to see the Qualcomm Snapdragon 690 5G processor here with the Moto G9 Power. That would have been pretty cool, and it would also give us 5G support, because this phone does not support 5G. Now, I know that having 5G support with the smartphone doesn't necessarily add that many benefits, at least at the moment, but the Qualcomm Snapdragon 690 5G processor would have given this device a pretty solid performance boost compared to the Moto G9 Power. So as far as the processor goes, from the G9 Power to the G9 Power, it's really not much of an improvement. But I hope you enjoyed my pros and cons and best and worst things about the Motorola Moto G9 Power. Again, in general, I think this is a very good phone, and it is a good release by Motorola. But there are definitely some strong points that this phone has, and then some weaker points as well, which I would like to see addressed in future Motorola smartphones. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Let me know what other videos you'd like to see me make about this device, and I will see you in the next one.